Welcome back and thank you for tuning in. Now firstly, I apologise, I still have this fairly bland looking office space, but it's a new house and we haven't had time to decorate yet, and it's not that important in the grand scheme of things. I think what's more important is that I was out in a local woodland fairly recently and I made some photographs that I'm really quite happy with. Here's the first example here. As you can see, there's some fantastic characterful oak trees, some lovely curving decaying branches. We've got a nice window through to a vanishing point in the scene. The conditions were fantastic and the soft light from the fog worked really well. I quite like the colour. We've got the subtle greens and we've got that rich golden colour coming through from the bracken which is turning and giving that really nice inviting autumn vibe. So as a whole, I'm really happy with the composition, the general mood and feeling in the image, but I'm never somebody just to take an image and then walk away. I like to linger for a little bit longer, see if there's any minor adjustments that I can make or if there's any alternative views which I can create. And I ended up with a 5-shot panoramic image, which is this one here. As you can see, the left portion of the image is pretty much that first image that you've seen, just a slightly different position. And the overall result, I'm really quite happy with it. It's something that I've talked about quite recently, is capturing these much wider woodland scenes, but they're a little bit more difficult to capture successfully and cohesively because there's so many components to include. I think what's quite nice, it's almost as if you're bringing in individual images that have their own merits and then piecing them together to create something that's a bit more immersive, and almost as if you can keep coming back to the image and enjoy different areas each time you view it. It's quite difficult to pull off, but I'm quite happy with this result. So I thought it would be quite nice or useful to you to talk through the editing process and to print this image as well. I talk a lot about visual intent in the field. So I'm going to use experience of being there to help inform some of the editing decisions that I make. But just as important is to talk about why I've made those choices. So let's jump straight in. Okay, so I've already stitched together 5 raw files and cropped it accordingly. Now, I'm not going to show you how to stitch together your raw files in Lightroom because it's really easy. It's just a few clicks and I want to keep the emphasis on the editing in this video. So in terms of aspect ratio, I don't think it really matters what the aspect ratio is when shooting panoramas, but I find it is useful to recognize what your boundaries are going to be when out in the field. So I already knew that this is where I wanted the image to start, a nice solid edge here, and finish over here with a nice solid edge. I wanted lots of this understory, all the lovely textured detail and colours coming through there. And I wanted a bit of the canopy to help frame the top, but I quite like the feeling of light coming through here, so I didn't want to crop that out. I like the light just hitting this tree, which is quite a nice little feature. But as it happens, this does conform to a 2:1 aspect ratio. I do like to stick to standards where possible, so that's worked really well because it's put a nice central component into the scene, and I do like central components in a lot of my images. So we've got the oak tree and the snapped branch just sat between these 2 bold trees here. This nice little feature oak tree here, and like I said, the left hand portion of the image is very similar to that first photograph which I showed. I've just moved ever so slightly so that I could get some optimal separation between all the other trees within the scene, but I do love this area through here, this feeling of depth and a nice little avenue for the eye to follow. I appreciate that things are looking a little bit dark and a little bit flat, and that's largely because I've exposed the scene for the brightest area up here. I wanted to make sure that I didn't blow the highlights in this area because I want to keep some of that detail and not lose too many of these edges. So that's looking really good to me. But a consequence of that is that it's looking a little bit darker over here. We've lost a feeling of light here. Now, my memory of it in person was that there was a much greater feeling of light filtering through into this area of woodland, which was part of the appeal for me. So we just want to get things back into balance. And that's essentially what we're trying to achieve a lot of the time here with photography, is balance. So we've got the balance of form, physical form in the scene, that looks good. We've got the balance of colour, a nice distribution of orange and green through the scene. But we just need a bit more manipulation of light and contrast. So this is probably going to require a little bit more work than what I typically do because of the dynamic range in the scene. So I really want to level things out, just flatten things to start with, get a better distribution of light, and then slowly reintroduce some contrast. So what I'd probably start off by doing is some very basic global adjustments. Now the white balance I think is pretty much fine. I do like to capture the scene as it looks in person or near enough, but I will add just a touch of magenta just to soften those greens ever so slightly. Now I think we can afford to push the exposure up a little bit, and then globally I'm going to be quite aggressive with dragging the highlights down. Probably more than I typically would, just because of this strong area of light up here. And then I'm going to really flatten things off by boosting the shadows. Now everything's looking quite wishy-washy, but don't worry, all will be revealed. And I'm going to soften things even more because I do like a little bit of negative clarity in my woodland scenes, just to make sure that nothing looks too brittle. And I'm even going to have a little bit of negative dehaze just to emphasize that fog. Now, I'm not usually a big fan of adding contrast with a contrast slider. It doesn't particularly work for my woodland scenes. So I like to, I just find I've got a bit more of a subtle and natural feel when introducing contrast with a tone curve and targeting those mid-tones. So I'm going to boost up the lights and then bring down the darks. And then we're starting to get a little bit more contrast back. Now, before I do anything with colour or split toning or anything like that, I just really need to do something about this bright area here and get a bit more light in over on this side. So I'll probably start with a graduated filter, and I'm going to drag it down just so it follows the lay of the land there. And I'm going to do something that might seem a little bit odd, but I'm going to be quite aggressive with actually having negative contrast there. It's softened things, it's lifted the shadow areas. It looks a little bit odd for now, but the whole idea, like I said, is to flatten things, and ultimately I'm looking for something that's going to be quite airy, quite ethereal, but knowing that I'm going to do some other things shortly which will introduce some more contrast. Now I do want lots of detail and a feeling of light across all this lovely foliage here. I'm probably going to take another grad, but this time bring it up from the bottom, tiny bit in the whites. I'm going to bring down the blacks ever so slightly for a little bit of contrast, just a tiny bit in the exposure, just to bring out lots and lots of detail down there. So that's pretty good. Now I might just have a quick look upside down, so I'm going to press Control and square bracket, just see how things are looking. Now it looks a little bit dark over here, and really quite bright up in this top left hand corner, or what would be the bottom right. So I'm going to flip it back round. I'm going to take a grad, bring it across over this way, and just lift the exposure just a tiny bit. And then I'll take a radial filter over this area and then drop the exposure down ever so slightly, so that feels a little bit better. I might even put a tiny radial over this, and then just bring down the highlights and whites of that, just to tone that back a bit so it's not catching my eye too much. We are getting a slightly better feeling of light over here, but I do want to balance this out a little bit more. So I'm going to take a big radial. I'm going to drag it right across this portion of the image. A decent feather, so we've got a nice natural transition. And again, using the highlights, be quite aggressive with reducing that, getting a bit more detail back in here. And I do like to bring the whites down as well, just to sort of soften those bright areas. You don't want to go too far because things start to look grey, which is a little bit odd. But just using the wheel on my mouse, I'm just going to bring that down to at -17 will do the job. And I'm going to soften this area again with a little bit of, sorry, not blacks, with a bit of negative dehaze. I still everything looks pretty much fine around here, but I still think this area could do with just toning back just a touch. So I'm going to knock the exposure down just a little bit there, bring a bit more detail back into those edges, and then just knock the whites down ever so slightly. I really want the eye to be drawn to this area as well. I think the key thing with these broad woodland scenes is getting the balance and for things to be aesthetically pleasing, which encourages the eye to travel around the scene. But I do think for this to be successful, we do need to boost the feeling of light in this area. So I'm going to have a fairly substantial radial filter there, and I'm going to boost the whites quite significantly. Again, it's about reintroducing the light that I felt was there. But I am even going to add an extra one just in that area there. Boost the whites there. Not too much, just a little bit, so it's still believable, but it just puts a little bit more attention on this lovely little tree there. Okay, so I'm feeling a little bit better about some of the light through the scene now, but I think the colour needs a bit of attention. Now, one thing that I remember at the time and what struck me was this lovely feeling of early autumn, and I love this transition of green to yellow to orange to these rusty colours. I think it's fantastic, so I do want to make sure that that comes through in the image. So I've come into hue, saturation, luminance. I'm going to jump down to saturation and I'm going to boost the oranges. I don't typically increase the saturation on colours, but I think it is important for those to come through, but not too much. We don't want to go too far like that, but just a small amount I think is quite nice. And I'm going to let those stand out a little bit more by reducing the saturation in the green. Not too much. I think even just -10 is enough. Split toning. Now, I'm really keen on colour contrast. I think it's nice to have some colour contrast. So I think what's important here is to maintain a little bit of coolness in the fog. So I'm going to come up and to a cool hue of about 230-ish. I'm just going to increase the saturation by 5. That's it. You can see even just 5 is making quite a big difference to the feeling of blue and coolness in the fog, which for me is quite natural to have that coolness there. But the shadows, I'm not particularly happy about the greens at the minute, and they're just a little bit too dominant in the scene. So for the shadows, I'm going to pick a fairly cool hue again, but moving a little bit more towards magenta. Maybe is about there. That's not looking too bad, slightly unnatural, but I think I'm going to make some adjustments down in calibration. Now, this is something that I've been starting to use a little bit more often. I think it has a really nice subtle effect to manage the colour in the scene. Now, if we go down to the green and adjust the hue, let's take it over to the left to the extreme. But you can see that it's changed the green to be a bit more yellow. There's a bit of mustard coming through there, which is a bit extreme. But if we knock it down just a little bit, and then we can start to make some of that green a touch more yellow. Equally with the blue, if we drag the hue to the left, then we'll see some of the reds starting to come through and the oranges, which again is too extreme. But if we bring it down to about -15, we can see that's starting to make some of the greens a bit more subtle, and some of that bracken is starting to come through a bit more. So if I just turn off the calibration and then back on again, you can see how we've started to get a little bit more of that autumn feel coming through, which I really quite like. So I'm just going to have a quick scan around at 100%, make sure that things are looking, everything's nice and soft here, but I've still got some really nice edges. We've got a good depth of field through the scene. Yeah, everything's looking pretty good. Fairly happy with it in terms of colour at the minute. So it still does need a little bit more contrast. I want to introduce a bit more richness. So it's at this point that I'll take it into Photoshop and apply a few more changes there. Now, you've probably seen me add an autumn effect to my images before, and it is something that I do quite often, but just to a very subtle degree. I don't want to push it too far, I don't want anything too dreamy. It's just about enhancing a quality that already exists within the image. So if there's that nice painterly quality and those lovely little textures, then I just want to add a little bit of richness to that. Now, the way that I do it is to duplicate the layer. So I press Ctrl J in Windows. I go to Image, Apply Image, make sure the blending mode is set to screen, and I click OK. I've now got a bright version of that image. I then go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. Now, the radius is going to depend upon the resolution of your image. I think for an image this big, I'm probably going to go for around about 36 pixels. I'm then going to change the mode of that new layer to multiply. And as you can see, you've immediately got that unrealistic kind of enchanted woodland feel, just an effect that's pushed way too far in my opinion. Take the opacity down to 0. And then this is at this point where I look at the image and then I start to reintroduce that effect. Because if I start from that, and then come backwards until I get something that looks quite good, then the chances are I'll maybe stop too soon and I'll end up with an effect which is just a little bit beyond what I'm comfortable with. So I tend to take it to 0, then look at the image and start to introduce the effect. And I think plus 21 would probably typically be the absolute max I would go to. And if we zoom into this scene, you can see there's tons of detail, and we're just getting that nice kind of glowing rich feel, but too far, and we're losing all that detail just enough so we start to get that richness. We get a slight increase in saturation, but we're just softening the edges so that we still get that lovely glowy enchanted ethereal feel. Then Control S to save that as a TIFF. It's going to take it back into Lightroom. And there it is. That's looking pretty good. And I think for printing purposes, I think this could be made even brighter. I think we can boost the tone curve even more. I don't want anything kind of too dark and moody for this. Like I said, I want a positive vibe. So I think boosting the lights a little bit more, I think, is going to give a much more pleasing result for print. Your paper choice when it comes to printing is absolutely crucial, and there's a number of factors to consider, such as the colour in the scene, the overall feeling that you want to get across in the end result, and your own style of photography. I wouldn't automatically suggest that you go for something glossy that's high impact with vibrant colours and deep blacks. It really just depends upon your own style. So when I look at my own work, I like to think it's subtle, there's a degree of softness, and it's very much reliant upon some of the finer details and textures and subtle colours in the scene. You know, I like the nuance of woodland, and I think a high gloss print almost distracts from some of those subtle qualities in the scene, which is why I always choose a matte paper. Now there's a variety of different matte papers to choose from, so it's really just a choice between whether I want a bright white paper or something warmer, something smooth or something textured. Now for something like this, a firm favourite of mine, which I've used many times, is Photospeed Platinum Etching. It's a really nice paper. It's got a bit of warmth to it. It's kind of got a velvety texture, and I think it works well with this because although I want to bring out all the detail in the bracken, I don't want it too crisp, and I think some of the texture in the paper just helps to soften those edges a little bit, and it kind of gives it that kind of classic timeless feel, which is just lifted absolutely beautifully when you put it behind glass. And although the coolness in the image is important, I don't want that to dominate, which is why a warm paper is also going to help here, because I do want that hint of coolness and freshness from the fog, but the importance, like I talked through when I was going through the processing, is the richness and the kind of early autumn feel in the understory. I do need that to come through. I think it will also work well with a smooth cotton paper, but to start with, I'm definitely going to go for this textured paper and see how that turns out. Because it is a fairly broad woodland scene, for me it's going to work better at A2 size and bigger, and I've got 12,000 pixels to play with here, so I kind of imagine this at about 4 foot wide on one of our walls at home. But yeah, let's try it at A2 and see how that turns out. As I mentioned in a previous video, it's imperative that you go through the calibration and profiling process of both your monitor, but also obtaining some custom profiles for your papers of choice. Now, some people get away with the generic profiles, which are provided by the paper manufacturer, but Photospeed do offer the free service to get some custom profiles, and I found them to be much better, with much better color accuracy compared to the generic profiles. So that's what I'm going to use when printing this. So I'm going to press Ctrl P just to double check everything in the print settings for my Canon Pro 1000. I'm going to go to print settings. I've got paper size A2, matte paper, highest print quality. I'm going to go to the main tab up here, just double check that the color intensity is set to manual. If I click set, go to matching, and show that color correction is set to none. Okay, that's all good. It just means the printer is not going to interfere with the color management here. And the settings which are recommended by Photospeed, which work for me, involve ensuring that color handling is managed by Photoshop, which will allow us to choose our printer profile. So I'm going to go to Platinum Etching. That's my custom profile obtained by Photospeed. Rendering tint, perceptual and black point compensation ticked. Now you can see I've scaled this down to 59%, even at A2, because it is quite a large image. I've given myself a border at the top of 1.1, the same on the left, and that's going to give another equal border on the right hand side. That's going to provide a little bit of room for mounting, makes the job a little bit easier for your framer. And then I can trim off the bottom afterwards, leaving plenty of room to number the print and sign here. So there you go, I'm happy with that. No doubt I'll do a bit more tweaking to the colour and luminance just to absolutely nail it, but that print is now available through my website. I've titled it Lothlorien, which is named after the Elven world in Lord of the Rings. Now, I'm not suggesting that that does justice to the magical kingdoms created in Lord of the Rings, but I don't know, it's just the atmosphere of these places kind of inspires that childlike imagination, and you could be fooled into thinking that goblins and fairies actually exist. So it's just good fun to be inspired by films and these stories of enchanted woodlands. So yeah, please check out my website, but also for workshops and now e-learning too. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode and found some value in it. So thank you very much for watching. And as always, I look forward to seeing you for the next one.